Left Right Radio with yours truly, Chuck Morse, Monday through Friday, every afternoon at 12 noon. Otherwise, sometimes not exactly 12 noon, whatever. This is internet, so we've got some leeway with regard to when we go on and not. My guest is Hal Shurtleff. Hal is the director of Camp Constitution. He's a longtime Boston area political activist. Has gotten into a lot of very interesting causes over the years, including flying a flag with a cross on it in front of the Boston City Hall. How shocking. Hal, I want to talk a little bit today about the controversy that's emanated from the Parkland shooting, in that the students seem to have broken down into two groups, one of them very much taking a left-wing position regarding gun control, the other more conservative position, and I think that's understandable. But of course, the liberal guys are getting all the attention. They had a big march. I'm reluctant to criticize them too much because they've been through a terrible trauma. You know, you don't have a sign every day that somebody shows up at your school with an AR-15 and starts murdering students. So, you know, I want to proceed with some caution. However, Laura Ingraham, fellow talk show host, has gotten in trouble for making mildly derisive remarks about one of the students, that being David Hogg, when she talked about how, he was whining because he wasn't accepted at certain colleges. She was using classic talk radio type jargon, and maybe she needs to get a little bit used to being on television where it's a little different type of a media. And it wasn't probably the best thing for her to have done. It would be much better for them to take on the student, in terms of their issues and their call for like very extreme gun control. But nevertheless, the response from the student has been classic leftism. And again, I say this in the context that these are students. They're not fully developed. I think they're being used, frankly, by people. But his comments are, she doesn't really mean it after she apologized, and that when she insults one of us, she insults all of us, and that basically I speak for all the students, putting aside the fact that they shut out anyone that didn't agree with them for their Sunday rally, and that he then published a list of her sponsors and asked that people boycott the sponsors. Now, the result has been that several of these companies, which are big companies, are now dropping out of sponsorship of her show, and that she's taken a 1-week leave of absence. Now, I find this situation to be quite chilling. I mean, I've been listening to left-wing radio, particularly progressive radio, people like Michael Signorilli, and they're rejoicing. They're like, oh, look at this. Look at the power we have. We can drive conservatives off the air now if they say something we don't like. And she said something very mild, putting that aside. The fact is that, to my way of thinking, this is a very, very troubling development. What say you?
Well, the first thing is this fellow David Hogg, the fact that he's made himself a public figure, or people have made him a public figure, means he should be prone to criticism. And whether you like it or not, maybe she shouldn't have made those comments, but I don't see it as a knockout factor. She didn't really get nasty. I mean, you can put on Cenk Uygur, and he's the foul-mouthed and cursing people all the time.
Yeah, Stephanie Miller.
Mm-hmm. So, but I think you're right. They're being used. There's no question about it. They're not the public. I call them government indoctrination centers. Public schools should not be a place for be politicized, but they have been for quite a long time. I attended a public school in the 70s. I think you probably did around that same time frame, maybe a little later. And I was in the height of forced busing, and we had a few walkouts, we had a few riots, but the teachers never encouraged us to fight forced busing or support forced busing. It was just ridiculous that they would engage in this. But not only the teachers, but the principals, and it's happened all over the country. And my comment about the walkouts is I'm okay with them walking out, but they should stay out and not go back in. They should completely, because these public schools, as our late mentor Sam Blumenfeld said, they're dangerous, not just mentally, but they're dangerous physically. And this demonstrates that. This young man who was involved in the shooting, the young man Cruz, he is a product of the government schools. You don't see this happening in Christian schools, parochial schools, or home schools. And they're not asking the right question. What causes these people to snap? Is it because they were bullied? Is it because they broke up with his girlfriend, or what happened? How come these things didn't happen back in the 60s, 70s, 50s, and earlier? How come they're sort of happening in the last 20 years? I think the first one was actually a young lady who shot a few people. She might have killed one person. This was in Kentucky, I think. She had broken up with a boyfriend. But most of these people that are engaging in these activities are under the psychotropic drugs. And that's really, I think, the bigger issue. And it's not
absolutely so. And I think that we're losing sight of the real question here, which you have brought up exactly, and that is what is going on with these young students to the degree that they would show up at a school and start killing people like that. I mean, it's I remember being in elementary school, junior high school, there would be an occasional fist fight, and you'd have
Absolutely.
a fist fly here and there. But the idea of this sort of thing was unthinkable back then, and it wasn't because there's more guns available now, because in fact there was more guns available back then.
Absolutely.
I remember growing up in Quincy, you could buy a gun over the counter at the Woolworths, and it didn't require all that much. I mean, so guns are actually more difficult to get now. So it's not really that. It has to do with the conditioning, as you imply quite accurately, of our young people. The late, great Sam Blumenfeld has written a lot about this. There's a shelf of books about it, including his last book, which was Crimes of the Educators, how our young people have been, conditioned, how they've been indoctrinated, how they've lost the ability or the lessons in terms of how to think cognitively. Instead, they're treated to behaviorism and the removal of God and the removal of the Bible from the schools, which started in 1962 with a Supreme Court decision, and which led to a sense of alienation. There's no prayer at the beginning of the class day. They no longer even say Pledge of Allegiance to the flag anymore. Maybe they do it once or twice a year. And, there's certainly, you can't find a constitution at the school. And,
right.
Our young people are taught in a way that it's a deliberate and conscious way to create confusion and dissonance in their minds. So as a result, you get people with emotional problems, learning disabilities, ADD, all the rest. These are all new phenomena. They were not around in the 1950s and 60s, and even in the early 70s. And so we have disaffected young people who are not well rooted in a sense of what is right, what is moral, what is good, what is evil. Everything is relative. And then you add into the mix psychotropic drugs, as you say. If you take a look at every one of these cases that we know about, and the ones we don't know about is because that hasn't been admitted, going back to Columbine, going back to all of them, they were all on drugs, all on some kind of controlled substance. These are very highly concentrated, very powerful substances. I'm not here weaving some conspiracy theory. You could just read the label. I mean, if you read the
well, you ever hear a commercial for one of these, Chuck, when they advertise these things, these psychotropic drugs, encouraging your doctor to give you one, get you a prescription, they'll say things like it may cause thoughts of suicide and death. Well, I don't know about you, but if I see that in a label that this is supposed to alleviate my thoughts of suicide, not promote them, and definitely not kill me. So they're very dangerous drugs, and it's big money. Big Pharma is really that. If anyone should leave the public schools, it should be Big Pharma. And people like Michael Moore and all the lefty pundits, they have an agenda. They want to see a disarmed America. That's their agenda. And I actually think that many of these people on the left look forward to these school shootings. I don't really think they care so much about the children. In fact, Moore, I get his tweets, and he said that he's so proud of these young people all over America that walked out. He's so proud of them. They should lower the voting age to 16 like they do in some European country. Wait a minute now. You think that 16-year-olds aren't responsible to own weapons? Oh, but they're responsible to vote. They want to raise the ability to up to 21 to get a what they call a semi-automatic. I think we should address that too.
Right.
Anytime you pull a trigger and a bullet comes out, a round comes out, that's semi-automatic. I have a Ruger 22 rifle that I bought in Woolworths in downtown Boston in 1980, and went home on the subway, and I lived across the street from a public school. And I know over the years, when I was still living there, sometimes the students would yell obscenities, and I never shot anybody with that in the public schools. And all the young people that I knew that had rifles never even thought of going to school with these rifles. But you put a 10-round magazine, and you can fire 10 rounds and then change it pretty quickly. So it can be very lethal. And the idea that it doesn't look like a military weapon, that's just they put a hand grip on it. They say it's a military-grade weapon, but an AR is not. And, in fact, if you look at the statistics, first off, the gun crimes are going down a whole lot all over the country. The murder rate's going down, except in certain places like inner cities, but we can't discuss that because then you call names.
Right.
The number of crimes that are used by ARs are infinitesimal, very, very few. Most of the crimes are used by handguns. Most of the murders are used by handguns. And so those are the things we have to deal with. And why is it? I mean, there are laws against murder, and people are still murdering. And like you said, there's a moral factor that's not being addressed here. What prompts a person to be so distraught? I mean, these people, as Sam Blumenfeld will say, they live in the greatest country in the world. They have more access to things. You know, these schools today, of course, the school's the problem. But, you know, they have shopping malls, they have computers, they have movies, they have all these great things, and yet they're still miserable. Why is that? Well, because the public schools teach them that they live in a purposeless and moral indifferent universe, that there are no absolutes right and wrongs, that our country is evil, it's wicked, it was founded by Eurocentric white males that own slaves, and all these negative things. And that's what they're hearing day in and day out. Then they turn on the media, they turn on the mass media, they hear the same thing. And they say, well, it must be the gun. The gun's the problem. The availability of guns is so easy. And you're right. It's not easy to get guns today like it was back, 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago when these things in public schools were unheard of.
Well, Hal, I think that it is more difficult today to get guns than it was. And I actually may not 100% agree with you here in that I think that it's not unreasonable to regulate AR-47s, the AK-47s or AR-15s or any of these weapons. I do think that you can make the argument that they are military-grade weapons. And from my reading of the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia means that, first of all, the militia, the way the Founding Fathers meant militia, was any male over the age of 18 was a militia. But the well-regulated part was that they had to be upstanding citizens.
That's right.
They couldn't be involved they couldn't have a criminal record. So I think that there can be some regulation in terms of a more vigorous background check, perhaps even maybe some training going in before someone gets a weapon like that. Some psychological testing, frankly, to be sure that the person involved, qualifies, just like, and it should be regulated on a state level, just like the way we would get an automobile, a license to drive a car.
Well, let me address the Second Amendment. I tell people that the Second Amendment didn't give us a right; it protected a right that already belonged to us. It simply said that it says that a well-regulated militia, being necessary for the defense of a free state, the right to keep bear arms shall not be infringed. That means Congress can't mess with that. Every state has a constitution. And all of the constitutions that I've seen, I haven't looked at all 50, but I've looked at a lot of them. In some cases, the wording is even stronger. The right to keep and bear arms shall not be questioned. Now, we understand that not every right is the right to free speech doesn't give me the right to go out and utter obscenities and destroy your character and make up stories because you have acts, libel, slander, or what have you. So you're right in that case. But the Second Amendment didn't give me that right. And a militia, that's a good issue, too, because in those days, it was up in Congress. And the Constitution hasn't been changed Article 1, Section 8 says that Congress's job is to make sure states have militias and that they write to rules and regulations for them. And well-regulated means basically that that militia unit knows how to perform their duties. What happened was in 1903, the Dick Act was passed, Congressman Dick, and they renamed the militia. They turned it into the National Guard. The militia was never supposed to be a National Guard. It was never supposed to be used outside of the United States. But as we became more of an empire, they figured, well, gee, we have all these soldiers, these militia people, but we can't take Massachusetts militia and bring them down to Cuba. We can't bring them to the Philippines. Right. So we can only use them in the United States and certain conditions when the Congress or the president may call them out to put down insurrections or what have you. And every able-bodied male, with some exceptions, but it was all organized locally. So the minute when you turned 18, Chuck, you didn't have to go to the recruiter. They would find you and say, hey, well, maybe we have enough now as our population has grown. Maybe we don't need you, but hey, we should give you some training and what have you. And so if need be. So the militia structure has been totally changed. But it's important to point out that Second Amendment protects the right. It doesn't give us that right. Now, states have most states have very strict laws and rules, waiting periods. In Boston, you have to take a course in how to fire that weapon before you can. And in the whole state of Massachusetts, each police chief has discretion. They can just deny you because they don't like the way you look. And some police chiefs that are very conservative will say, hey, as long as you don't have a police record. And I do agree, if you have some felony convictions or you have some kind of mental illnesses, you shouldn't be with a weapon. And it's interesting. I just read recently that if you're using medical marijuana, I think what state it was in, but they won't allow you to have a gun or a weapon. So it's kind of all these people that are flocking to these pot shops now. Yeah, you smoke marijuana, and then you're probably going to lose your right to keep and bear arms.
Well, that's certainly ironic, isn't it?
It certainly is.
And that, of course, Hal, you're bringing up an important question, which is the fact that the Constitution, and we should remind people, it doesn't grant rights. The Constitution simply recognizes God-given natural rights. That was an understanding by the founding generation.
That's right.
It's something that's obvious to anyone who observes nature. I mean, animals understand property rights. Try to interfere with the property of a dog, as I've said. I mean,
my dog will bite you if you go after her food source. It doesn't matter how much food, but if you try to take her food away, she's going to turn on you. Oh, yeah.
Exactly. So animals understand a beaver protects its dam, a bird protects its nest. I mean, these are natural rights, observable in nature. It's not the fact that, the left would try to abolish these rights or say the state has the right to grant them is the most basic proof of how their whole philosophy is false and is based on fool's ideas. So given the fact that the Constitution recognizes already existing rights, in that context, I think you are illustrating that the states have the constitutional responsibility to, and the local cities and towns, or preferably the sheriffs, have the responsibility to regulate those rights. And in the case of the Parkland shooter, of course, we find out that he would have had a criminal record if the government had functioned properly. But because of Obama and Eric Holder doing this pilot program that was being experimented with in Parkland, Florida, which basically reduced the number of people arrested or the number of people having a criminal record in high school because they felt that it was discriminating against minorities and that it would hurt their record. They would basically be involved with a situation where somebody had committed a crime and the police were told to just let them go, but to give them, a private reprimand. And this is how this guy slipped through the cracks, because otherwise he would have had a record. I mean, he was involved in several instances of physical abuse. I guess he beat up his mother a couple of times. He was talking about a very bad guy who would have had a record, but because of this program, I think they call it Operation Promise or some utopian name, he slipped through the cracks. And as a result, he was able to get a gun, because if he had a record, he wouldn't have been able to have gotten a gun as easily.
Oh, he could have simply stole one too. Either you get one through legal channels, or you steal one, or borrow one, or have a friend loan him one, or what have you. So no matter what, he may have been able to get that. I mean, look at Eric Holder and Obama. They made it possible for Mexican drug dealers to get guns, and they used it against some of our border patrol people. So
That's right.
getting the gun isn't the problem. But the system failed. All the system that was set up to keep those people safe, those young people safe in that school, failed. I think the FBI was notified about this young man's behavior. The local police, they totally ignored it. And then when he comes out and does something like this that nobody expects, it's not his fault. It's not the sheriff's fault, the deputy sheriff, or the man who was ordered to stand down or stood down. It's the gun. It's the weapon. It's the NRA. The NRA are mass murderers. And
the kid himself called the authorities and said, "I'm going to kill someone," and they ignored it. I mean, how much more do they need to do something? But yes, I mean, it was just as you say.
The agenda is disarmament. That's been it's interesting, and you're probably aware of this. In 1961, the U.S. State Department came out with State Department Document 7277. It was authorized by John Kennedy. And it said 3 steps to have a standing Royal Army, and then civilian disarmament. The only people who would be allowed to own weapons would be those of approved types by the UN to be used by police forces. And that is the agenda. People don't want to talk about it. They want to philosophize and say they're just wrong on it. But there is an agenda, and you have to understand that.
Yeah, I mean, look at the Constitution, as you point out, Hal, allows local communities to regulate things like weapons and whatnot. Not certainly the federal government at all, and certainly not some sort of international agency. So I'm glad you're pointing that out. But getting back to the subject, by the way,
you can find that 7277. Yep. Go online. It's like a 15, 16-page report. And Freedom from War, that's the name of the document. And the bottom line is that the individuals don't start wars. Governments start wars. And the only way to stop wars is for governments to stop, creating war. And then sometimes a war is just. And we can argue which wars are just and non-just, but that's really the last thing you want to do is go to war. That's when everything else breaks down. And there has been time when we had to go to war, and it was justified. But there's been a lot of other wars that we've been involved in, these UN wars that are undeclared, that have not. We're still in Korea, for goodness sakes. That war never ended. It's just been a truce. So
that's right. And that gets into the whole subject of why President Trump is under attack by the establishment, including the liberal Republican establishment, to a degree that, I mean, I've never seen this intense. And there's a certain amount of suggestivity and even, frankly, I'm going to say it, mind control involved in the type of attack he's under, because average people have become, for lack of a better word, they're deranged. I mean, I think you've seen this.
Well, it's interesting. A gentleman was walking down the street, and someone in the neighborhood, we were conversing, and he said, "Trump is racist." I said, okay, give me some evidence. He had none. I said, "What about him?" Was he a Klansman? I actually I found a couple of interesting videos on YouTube. One of them was a video of Jesse Jackson. This would be 1998 or 97, praising Donald Trump for his support of hiring minorities and giving them good pay in his businesses. And then the famous heavyweight championship fight, Mike Tyson and the man he beat in one round. But they fought at a Trump hotel, and Donald Trump is in the ring, and there's Muhammad Ali and Mike Tyson and a lot of black fighters from the past and so forth, and they're all singing his praises. I'm thinking, well, if this guy was a screaming racist, why would he would be in the ring with all of these black people?
Oh, I mean, look, Hal, the whole charge is absurd, and it's an ugly smear that's brought up against anyone that doesn't goose step to the left. But in the case of Trump, it's particularly odious, given the fact that the New York Times, they sent out some reporters to investigate Trump's businesses, figuring they were going to find, all lily white, males. And they found that his businesses are very well integrated, both with women and with minorities at all levels, including the top executives. And so they didn't do a story. They just ignored it.
They ignored
okay,
it, right? Because the narrative wasn't.
Obviously, the facts of the matter are, as Trump himself very accurately pointed out during his State of the Union address, which was an extraordinary speech, that African American unemployment is at the lowest level today that it's ever been since they've been recording unemployment levels, and that his popularity has increased in the Black community, particularly among Black men. I think it's up to almost 20%. Now, there's a long way to go.
That's right.
But this is where Trump is the biggest threat to the left. The fact is that minorities and millennials, too, I point out, these are his natural constituents. This is where his message should resonate the most. Getting rid of lowering taxes, getting rid of onerous regulation, putting in protections for American businesses, not getting involved in foreign wars, a pro-America, America first approach. That's exactly the thing that minorities, more than anybody, should embrace and are going to embrace. And that is the biggest threat to the establishment, which is why you have this phenomena of an international and media and cultural and even business combined and orchestrated attack against him, which is unprecedented and which is resulting in a kind of almost a behavioral modification by masses of people.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I certainly, understand that anytime any Republican is going to be subjected to a certain amount of a hate campaign, right? I mean, we all remember like the last 2 years of the Bush administration. I remember the hate campaign against Reagan. All 8 years, and the investigations and the hatred and the belittling. And we certainly remembered what happened to Richard Nixon. He wasn't even that conservative, but nevertheless, they were ready out there. It was like with torches, ready to burn him at the stake. I mean, I'm even old enough to remember the whispers about Barry Goldwater. He's a Nazi, he's going to blow up the world.
He actually was a man of, I think he was Jewish. He was.
But nothing like this all pales in comparison to what's going on with Trump. And I think it's because Trump really is in a position. He's a revolutionary figure. He's really taken a position where he has the tools to actually implement what he's talked about. They've all talked about, securing the southern border. I mean, Obama talked about this, but everybody knows
Bill Clinton did too. Again, YouTube is great because you can actually find stuff that you couldn't have access to before it was created.
That's
you
can
right. Find Bill Clinton giving a State of the Union address, calling for secure border. Nancy Pelosi, the same thing. Our borders are porous, and we need to secure our borders and help the American workers so their jobs aren't being taken away. And that sort of thing.
Oh yeah, even Obama said this, but everybody knew that he didn't mean it.
Now it's racist when you articulate that. Somehow,
well, it's because Trump actually means it. He's a plain-spoken person who is, putting some teeth behind it. He's not just engaging. They all want the liberals to lie about these things. They figure it's boo bait for the bubbas,
Mm-hmm. That's
but
right.
With Trump, he's actually doing it. So the result is that average people, and I've come across it, I know you have too, that they've become deranged. It's almost like an imbalance. It's like they're absolutely out of their minds. I mean, they won't even mention his name in public or even privately. It's like they're so angry that I don't know how they get through a day like that. It's insane.
As a constitutionalist, there haven't been too many presidents that I can point to and say these guys are upheld their oath in my lifetime. Anyway, I may go back to Calvin Coolidge,
right?
But that's a long time. But and he had his issues. He wasn't perfect either. But But let's go back a little bit to the gun control issue or the Second Amendment issue. There was a book written by a Florida professor. His last name was Glick, I think, Glick. More guns means less crime. Initially, he was in favor of strict gun control. And he did a report, and he looked at all the states and the stats and the FBI reports, and he concluded that the more guns there are, the less crime there is. And you look at states like Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, states that have a very large per capita gun ownership, whatever that may be, 3 or 4 weapons per person. and the gun violence, violent crime is very, very low. You very seldom hear of a murder in Vermont or any of these other states, and if it does, it's usually a crime of passion, not some drive-by shooting. And that's part of the culture living in these states, that dad has a gun, a rifle, a weapon. He teaches you when you're a child. You learn respect for that. That's a potential dangerous weapon. It's a tool that could kill. So you have respect for that. It's something that's ingrained. I go to a privately owned range, and there's more gun discipline than there is in a military range. And that when I went in the Army, there were certain protocols and discipline you on the range. I see that even more so. You never point a weapon. You always assume it's loaded. This sort of thing. And the number of gun accidents have gone down a lot too, as people become more informed about these kinds of things and more educated. So I don't think they've ever done a study, but I'd love to see a study based on the square mileage, where crime is being committed per square mile. And we know that most of the gun crime, violent crime, is committed in certain cities, and not even the whole city, but certain neighborhoods in certain cities. But again, you can't articulate this message because you'd be construed as racist or what have you. But in Chicago, at the south side of Chicago is where most of this violent crime is happening. In Boston, it's usually Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, and it happens in other. But for the most part, most of the murders are happening in these communities that are minority communities. And it's too bad that minorities are the ones that are suffering the most. If anybody should be armed to defend themselves, it should be minorities. And it's interesting, too, the history of gun control is the history of anti-Semitism and the history of racism. And I'm not suggesting that everybody supports gun control as an anti-Semite or a racist, but, in the 1840s, in the wake of the Nat Turner slave insurrection, they made it very difficult for free blacks and slaves to carry weapons. They used to, the slaves would go hunting, on the estate. They carry weapons and never thought about using them against their owners. And then after that, they made it even after the Civil War, they have what they call black codes, making it difficult for certain people. And in New York City in the early 1900s, the Sullivan Code, they didn't want immigrants to own weapons. They didn't want Italian immigrants or Irish immigrants. So, and we know what happened in Nazi Germany, the gun control. Although the Nazis did invent gun control, it was been around a long time.
Absolutely. In fact, my understanding is that one of the reasons the NRA was set up right after the Civil War was to help black people get guns.
That's right. In fact, there was an ancestor of mine that was actually a Civil War general. He organized the first all-black regiment in Ohio, and there's a statue of him in Oberlin where he was a professor, and he ended up donating his house to the school. There's a statue of him, and initially it was going to be a statue of General Shurtleff handing a black man a weapon, because he believed, he said, these people, they have to fight for their freedom. And that's
Incredible.
Why he was a very staunch abolitionist, but he believed that the black man should be armed to defend himself. And now you have most of these black leaders. It's amazing. It's interesting too. They hate Donald Trump. He's evil. He's a Nazi. He's a racist. He's a Klansman. Yet they want to give him more power to disarm people in the inner cities. That doesn't make any sense to me.
No, in fact, as you point out, the largest gun-owning state in the Union, in terms of per capita, the number of people who own guns versus the population, is none other than Bernie Sanders' Vermont.
That's right.
And New Hampshire and Maine. These are liberal-ish states, big gun-owning states. Whereas the most heavily regulated areas like Chicago and Washington, D.C., have the highest level of crimes with a gun is used in the commission of the crime. And most of the guns involved in those crimes are illegal.
That's right.
I think that if people genuinely want to support gun control, they would support the very difficult and painful and dangerous work of going into these inner cities and clearing out people who are in possession of illegal guns. And that's not an easy job to do, but that's how you get a handle on gun control.
And by the way, you don't see any inner city gangbangers going to gun shows in rural areas and buying guns and that's not happening. We have tables we have information tables at gun shows over the years. and black people come to gun shows, but you don't see it, and they still, you can't just pick up, load up your truck and get a bunch of rifles and bring them to Boston or bring them to New York. It's just not happening. That's the myth that they want you to believe so they want to be able to clamp down on these things too.
Exactly. So Hal, we've kind of covered the lot here in terms of the social underpinnings of young people going into the school and shooting their fellow students, and the type of education, the liberal change agent education that has contributed to that, the stripping away of belief, the stripping away of the Constitution, of moral standards. We talked about gun control. We talked about, the agenda on an international level to disarm America, the use of some of these Parkland kids by putting them up as spokespeople and sending them out there. And of course, they're taken in by that. I want to sort of wrap it up. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about what you're up to, Hal, in terms of Camp Constitution. I see you have a big flyer behind you. It's a family
yes,
camp.
that's yeah.
Talk about what's up with that.
Well, we have a wonderful week-long family camp in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, August 5th to the 11th. And this year we have a very good. We have a good lineup every year, but this year we have as guest instructors we have Lord Christopher Monckton, the British Lord, who is very big on the Brexit.
Oh, yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, he's quite a man. He's a very humorous man as well. And we have Mrs. Chris Ann Hall, who's a constitutional attorney. She travels all over the country. When she's not at her in Haiti with her Christian mission there, she's traveling around the country teaching people about the Constitution. And we have Professor Willie Soon, who'll be a great guest for you at some point. He's out of Harvard Smithsonian. He's returning. He's one of the top experts on climate change. Actually, I call him a climate realist. And we have Dr. Duke Pesta.
Good.
Dr. Duke he's just going to be in camp for a couple of days. He can't spend the whole week. So this will be the first time he's there and the first time the British Lord. And we have people like John McManus and Reverend Stevie Kraft and Pastor Earl Wallace and some other instructors. It's a great week. We have some historic tours. We're going to be taking a trip to the Battle of Saratoga battle site, Battle of Bennington battle site, and some other places. So we're looking forward to that as well.
And how do people get information about it, Hal?
Campconstitution.net. Just go to our website and you get information about that. We also started a weekend camp in Maine. It's a smaller venue. It's going to be in the middle of September. So we're not expecting people from around the country, but it's available. We got about 30 or 40 people at that weekend camp. So we hope to start other camps around the country. We have a speakers bureau and we have a great YouTube channel. We're averaging now about almost 2,000 views a day. It's really the last couple of days. It's really picked up. It's very
fantastic.
Yeah, all the interest we're getting.
Well, very good, Hal Shurtleff. I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon. Great talking with you, Hal.
Always, Chuck. It's a pleasure.
All right. Have a good day. And thanks everybody for watching.